PowerPoint, Corina? Sorry, that's it. Let me introduce Corina Stan. You know, she's an associate professor of comparative literature at Duke University. She has published extensively. I'm just mentioning the one I chose earlier. I already forgot. The forthcoming.
It's actually out.
It's already out. Okay, perfect. It's the Public Handbook of European Migration in Literature and Culture, together edited together with Charlotte Sussman. And her presentation today is entitled Reparations on Disfigured Souls, the Tragedy of Colonial Blinding in Abdul Razak Gurna's Afterlives.
Thank you very much. I would like to join my voice to the chorus of thanks to the organizers and also to all of you, because I have learned so much from your presentations. I really appreciate having been here over the past 3 days. For me, this is work in progress. It's part of a book on the European self-understanding after decolonization entitled After the West. So I will appreciate reactions, feedback. I know there are some specialists in the room on the topic. So the title is Reparations on Disfigured Souls, the Tragedy of Colonial Blinding in Abdul Razak Gurna's Afterlives. To read the archive of slavery is to enter a mortuary. Saidia Hartman writes in Venus into Acts. Thinking of old enslaved women who in the hold of the ship or on plantations were victims of annihilating violence, abuse, rape, mentioned in passing in stories of scandalous success, she laments the absence of first-person accounts of such experiences and gives these women the name Venus. Hartman thinks of this Venus as both haint, that is, one who haunts the present, and as disposable life. The dream is to liberate them from the obscene descriptions that first introduced them to us. Since one cannot exceed the constitutive limits of the archive, what kinds of stories, she asks, can one tell about those who live in such an intimate relationship with death? Romances, tragedies, shrieks that find their way into speech and song, this by way of Fred Moten's formulation of the commodity that speaks. I take these questions with me as I engage today with the work of Zanzibar-born British author Abdul Razak Gurna, the 2021 Nobel Prize laureate, work that seeks to fill in the gaps of the archive documenting Indian Ocean slavery, captivity, military migration, and death. Gurna's 2020 novel Afterlives, which I focus on, does not concern itself with enslaved women, but with a more controversial collective subject, harder to extricate from the obscenity of violent excess. The Askari soldiers, African mercenaries recruited by the Germans in colonial Tanzania, who fought in the Schutztruppe on behalf of the Germans. The question of ethical representation imposes itself from the outset. How does one erase such blinding as that of the Askari, who were perpetrators of crimes against fellow Africans and complicit victims of a colonial ideology that cast them as racially inferior to their white masters? Disposable, marked from the moment of their conscription by what historian Orlando Patterson famously calls social death, they were not just captive minds, to borrow Czesław Milosz's formulation as it speaks of communist intellectuals, but captive souls. Gurna had to narrate a tragic story of self-inflicted moral injury without committing further violence in the act of narration. Since there is no first-person account left by an Askari, Gurna is constrained by the boundaries of the archive and has to be mindful, like Hartman, of a responsibility of form. So, how does he do it? The narrator speaks like a historian who does not shy away from providing a full picture of the atrocities committed by the German Schutztruppe, showing how the Askari were known for their particularly vicious brutality. It introduces the character Ilyas Hassan, but after describing the circumstances that led to his volunteering as an Askari in World War I, he absents himself from the novel, which turns its attention to the romance between Ilyas's sister Afia and another Askari, Hamza, who after the war redeems himself through work and marriage. So there are two very different personal destinies that are explored here, right? So one is an Askari who disappears, and another one is an Askari who redeems himself through integration into post-war Swahili society, then under British rule. Decades later, the son of Afia and Hamza, also named Ilyas, travels on a fellowship to West Germany, pieces together from state archives scattered facts about his uncle's life in post-imperial Germany. And so that's when we finally learn on the last 3 pages of the novel what happened to this man. It turns out that the elder Ilyas went to Germany after World War I, performed in cabarets in his askari uniform, participated in Nazi rallies asking for the return to Germany of colonies in Africa, and died in a Konzentrationslager, where he was sent for breaking Nazi race laws by having an affair with a German woman. This information is delivered factually at the end of the novel, as if Gurna suddenly forgot that fiction is supposed to show, not tell. We don't get to see what Ilyas's family does with the knowledge of his undignified life and death. So there's no model for the way we readers might react. We are left wondering whether the novel is a tragedy because it begins and ends with a tragic life, or whether the romance at the heart of it redeems the tragedy. Differently put, are we supposed to reorder the events of the novel chronologically from the misguided choices of the elder Ilyas to the accomplishments of the young nephew, and understand the time of history as one of redress, a teleology of the soul, degraded and then lifted, redeemed? Can one speak of symbolic repair at the end if it remains only sketched, intimated, but not actually narrated? It seems to me, and this is the line of thought that I will pursue in what follows, that in not trespassing the boundaries of the archive, Corina raises questions about the ethics of representation that resonate with the reflection of intellectuals invested in understanding how the enslaved and the colonized could come to terms with a modernity forcibly imposed on them. Afterlives, I argue, dramatizes conscription as both romance and tragedy in order to meet contemporary demands to conceptualize ethical memory. In the context of public discussions about reparations, Corina's novel intimates that, perhaps even more difficult than the question of material reparations, is the issue of moral reparations. So in the end, I reformulate the question of haunting in the terms of Jill Scott Heron's song, "Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul?" Part 1, Death in Migration. The plot of Afterlives emerges against the background of colonial devastation, violence, and death. The novel is set during the scramble for Africa, when the Germans and the British as a whole, and the French and the Belgians and the Portuguese and the Italians and whoever else had already had their Congress. This refers to the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, and drawn their maps and signed their treaties. It begins with the Al-Bushiri Uprising in 1888, during which Arab and Swahili coastal and caravan traders resisted the German claim that they were rulers of the land. It zooms in on the history of the Dutch East Africa between 1885 and 1919, and the suffering of the many other peoples who were reluctant to become German subjects. So there are a lot of scenes of devastation, of violence, of starvation. The colonial administration thinks that their military response, however relentless and brutal, was insufficient, so they proceeded to starve the people into submission. They burned villages and trampled fields and plundered food stores. African bodies were left hanging on roadside gibbets in a landscape that was scorched and terrorized. In the end, the Germans, and I quote again, "Maji victory left hundreds of thousands dead from starvation and many hundreds more from battlefield wounds or public execution." So by the start of World War I, when Ilyas plans to join the askari, another man tries to dissuade him. I quote, "In the 30 years or so that they have occupied this land, the Germans have killed so many people that the country is littered with skulls and bones, and the earth is soggy with blood." This remarkable image, which becomes a haunting leitmotif of a country littered with skulls and bones, its earth soggy with blood, captures the place from which Corina begins the novel, the colonial archive as mortuary, which imposes on him the responsibility to write a collective biography of dead subjects as a counter-history of the human. The formulation belongs to Hartman. The skulls and bones point to corpses left unburied for too long, having disintegrated into unrecognizable remnants of the once living bodies of fathers, sons, loved ones, that they littered the country suggest their desecration to something resembling disposable trash, discarded on a land that is no longer a home in the world. Indeed, it is an entire world that's thrown off its axis. The blood soaks the earth, but not as part of a ritual of renewal of the community that would honor a sacrifice. Rather, it suggests senseless death, that is, deaths that make no symbolic sense, uncounted and unaccounted for. The denial of proper burial is a severance of the ties with the ancestors and with the descendants, a catastrophe of cosmic proportions. One is reminded here of Wallace Shayanka's play Death and the King's Horseman, in which the titular character fails to perform his duty towards his Yoruba community, and some of you will remember that the horseman is also confused, like Elias, by the significance of the colonial intervention. Shayanka insisted, however, that the play was not about the cruel dilemma of a character, rather that any director should highlight what he called the Thanatic essence of the play, which I take to mean its character of lament of a world unsettled in a metaphysical sense. So I am using migration in this expanded sense. A world reduced to a display of dismembered bodies, an inventory of bones. It is doubtless impossible, as Foucault would say, to ever grasp these lives again in themselves as they might have been in a pre-state. The question is, again in Hartman's formulation, whether it is possible for the writer to exhume buried cries and reanimate the dead. Gurna would not here. The young Elias is tormented by a whispering ailment, by pain-racked cries in the middle of the night, and the blood-curdling voice that asks relentlessly where Elias the elder is. So the young boy is haunted by the elder Elias, right, the disappeared Elias. So these shrieks, this curdling voice, this blood-curdling voice, disrupts the story of resilience the novel seemed to be narrating in the negative space carved out by Elias's disappearance through tropes of marriage, labor, and the integration into the community of Hamza the Askari. In other words, through all the fixtures of the Bildungsroman embedded into the teleology of universal history as flourishing and progress towards freedom, the haunting of the young Elias rekindles feelings of guilt in both parents, in Afia for not having found and given her brother a proper burial, in Hamza for the crimes he committed as an Askari in World War I. As the young Elias grows up supported by his loving parents, the story pursues its quiet meditation on resilience and overcoming of the traumatic legacy of bondage. The closure is sketched on the last 3 pages of the novel, when the young Elias, returned from his research trip to Germany, gives his parents a summary of his uncle's life as he has pieced it together in the archives. So we are really left at the margins of the archive. Like Saidia Hartman then, Corina does not trespass the boundaries of the archive. He traces the itinerary of a disappearance, of a death foretold and anticipated, but refrains from offering a model for the work of commemoration. It signals, however, its difficulty formally in a poignant contrast between the family's grief after the elder Elias's disappearance and the striking image of a man celebrating in song and dance the ideology of Nazism. I quote from the last page of the novel. The Nazis wanted the colonies back, and Uncle Elias wanted the Germans back. So he appeared on their marches carrying the Schutztruppe flag and on platforms singing Nazi songs. So while you were grieving for him here, Elias said, Uncle Elias was dancing and singing in German cities and waving the Schutztruppe flag in marches demanding the return of the colonies. Lebensraum did not only mean the Ukraine and Poland to them. The Nazi dream also included the hills and valleys and plains at the foot of that snow-capped mountain in Africa. If we remember that the disappearance of Elias stands in metonymical relationship to the devastation inflicted by colonial violence, the uncle's betrayal is amplified. The moral blindness of his political allegiances to an ideology premised on racial hierarchy returns tragically against him. César's boomerang of European civilization is an apt image here, when he's sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp along with his son, where they both die. At the novel's end, the reader finds herself contemplating the archive, left to ponder these weighty matters of tragic betrayal, blinding, and undignified death. What is an ethical way of commemorating the Askari, both as saint, that is one who haunts the present, and as disposable life? The idea of liberating these soldiers, who are both victims and criminals, from accounts of abject death seems preposterous. Like the officer in Kafka's In the Penal Colony, Ilyas walks blindly into the torture machine. There is no epiphany or transfiguration at the end, no possible redemption. So who will pay reparations on his soul? Part 2, Conscripts of German Civilization. To address the question of reparations, we need to situate ourselves in the longue durée perspective of history that Corina's work engages with. In his 1994 novel Paradise, he records the end of the Arab Swahili caravan trade, replaced by German colonialism. In Afterlives, German colonialism is replaced by British rule. This phenomenon of acculturation as conquest has been described by anthropologist Stanley Diamond, whose reflection Talal Assad places in the epigraph to his essay, Conscripts of Western Civilization. I quote Diamond in Assad, as quoted by Assad. Either civilization directly shatters a primitive culture, which happens to stand in its historical right of way, or a primitive social economy, in the grip of a civilized market, becomes so attenuated and weakened that it can no longer contain the traditional culture. In both cases, refugees from the foundering groups may adopt the standards of the more potent society in order to survive as individuals. But these are conscripts of civilization, not volunteers. The African chief who destroys Uncle Aziz's caravan in Paradise points out that the Arab Swahili trading system brought evil into our world. Quote, "You have made slaves of us and swallowed up our world," unquote. This criticism of Arab hegemony will be echoed in Afterlives, where Ilyas's claim that Germans are honorable citizens and civilized people is met with derision. "My friend, they have eaten you," Ilyas is told. The metaphors of incorporation, swallowed up, eaten, suggest the inescapability of a new system that imposes new categories. As Talal Assad has shown, the older society is destroyed and remade by the forces unleashed from conquest. Corina's two novels, Paradise and Afterlives, register the destruction and remaking of East Africa under the impact of European imperialism and industrial capitalism, which fostered the creation of conditions in which only new, that is, modern choices can be made. On the face of it, Ilyas and Hamza can only become conscripts. Ilyas escapes the poverty of his family and is raised by a German farmer who sends him to a German school, while Hamza is sold by his father to a merchant in order to repay his debts. Thus, conscription has to be taken both literally, so they become soldiers, and metaphorically, the way Talal Assad and after him David Scott use the term. They are conscripts of Western modernity. The idea of conscripts, as opposed to volunteers, captures an essential realization, namely that the New World has been forcibly created as a consequence of the West's imperial adventure, and that the categories, political, economic, cultural, in terms of which that world has increasingly come to live, have been put in place by characteristic modalities of modern power. In the terms of John Stuart Mill, it was essential to implant in native minds something they lacked, namely a spring of spontaneous improvement, a desire for progress that required the exercise of despotic powers, including, where necessary, violence. And so this is where the study come in. The training is explained in no ambiguous terms. They are told that they are swine, they are beasts, and they have to be fortunate. They have to feel fortunate to be Askari. The narrator also notes the irony of the Askari's blinding. Hamza, for example, is taught German by a noble lieutenant, beginning with a sentence, "Sie sind herzlich willkommen in meinem Land." So you're heartily welcome in my country, but you have to say it with conviction, he says. After months of linguistic practice, he anticipates that Hamza will perhaps be able to read Schiller, who stands in the novel as the paragon of German high culture. All the while, the Askari fight, leaving the land devastated, its people starving and dying in the hundreds of thousands, while they struggled on in their blind and murderous embrace of a cause whose origins they did not know and whose ambitions were vain and ultimately intended for their domination. Now, Schiller and the German culture it stands for is to the Askari what La Bérénale was to Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution. And so I have a whole section here on David Scott's critical engagement with CLR James's The Black Jacobins. Now, very briefly, what this is about is that in the original edition of 1938, CLR James narrated in theological fashion the hero of the Haitian Revolution to son of virtue, leading his oppressed people to freedom, right? And that was written at the outset of the nationalist assault on British colonial rule in the Caribbean. So there was a lot of hope and revolutionary energy and optimism. But then when he revised it in 1963, he added a few paragraphs to the book in which the insistence is on the tragic character of Toussaint's Louverture error, which in short derived from the fact that he inhabited a cognitive universe, the universalist ideals of the French Revolution, which he could neither simply claim as his own nor completely disavow. It was the error of a conscript, says CLR James. And so this is important because this emphasis, the shift of emphasis from romance to tragedy, I think is very interesting to bring into the discussion of the novel. And my question whether we are supposed to take this as a tragedy or to pay attention to the romance and the possible redemption of the older Elias from the younger one, from the younger figure. Now, CLR James builds his conception of tragedy around the Hegelian understanding of collision or conflict. Here, a clash between competing and irreconcilable conceptions of history within the life of a single person. In the case of Elias Essen, so he actually took the name Elias Essen in afterlife in Germany, the two conceptions are that of colonial enlightenment, in which Toussaint Louverture also tragically believed, premised on the teleology of universal history as a progress towards freedom for all, and the Nazi myth of the superior Aryan race and the nation without space, which led to the final solution. Gournot, as the German Oberlieutenant, denounced the senseless war. We lied and killed for this empire and then called it our Zivilisierungsmission. He speaks to the realization that the civilizing mission was never about turning Africa into a world of free individuation, but a project of expropriation and domination in which the Askari served to perpetrate and legitimate the violence and its justification. And so, very briefly, to get to my conclusion, when we learn that, when the younger Elias finally finds in the archives his uncle, it's through a photograph of the publication Kolonie und Heimat, where in the photograph there are a group of Nazis and then an African man in Schutztruppe uniform, and behind them the flag of the Reichskolonialbund, a corner of which displayed the swastika. So this photo sounds very much like the photograph that Roland Barthes analyzes in Mythologie of a black soldier saluting the French flag on the cover of Paris Match in July 1955. And then the image of Elias Essen performing in low-life Hamburg cabarets, wearing the military uniform of an Askari, speaks precisely caters to a German fantasy of African acquiescence in the ideology of white racial superiority, as well as of the willing participation of Africans in their domination by Germans. It's interesting to think of this moment where Elias has completely hollowed himself out and became the uniform, a puppet performing the role of the integrated reject. His blinding consisted in believing that he could be acknowledged as a subject, but he performed himself as an abject. So I'm entering here the domain of psychoanalysis with Kristeva's intervention in Lacanian psychoanalysis with the abject. All right, and here is my conclusion. The tragedy, so it's called Afterlives, just as a gesture to the title of the novel. The tragedy of colonial enlightenment, Scott writes in Conscripts of Modernity, is not to be perceived in terms of a flaw to be raised or overcome, but rather in terms of a permanent legacy that has set the conditions in which we make of ourselves what we make, and which therefore demands constant renegotiation and readjustment. It is in this framework that I think any discussion of reparations must be placed. No amount of material reparations, however important, and discussions are ongoing in Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and elsewhere, can pay the debt incurred by the breaking of Europe's promise of universal freedom. As Simon Blandini shows in Europe of Philosophical History, this vision of universal history can be traced back to Kant, who envisioned the expansion of Locke's social contract theory on an international scale, first in Europe, and that was the philosophical foundation of the European Union, then the world. The vision of this contract, which drove the civilizing mission, was a moral good, and its abrogation a moral debt. In practical terms, this framework for flourishing and freedom relied on the massive exploitation, military, economic, symbolic, of colonized people on the production not of subjects, but of what I call in my book After the West, integrated rejects, people indispensable to the system, but whose lives did not matter. As Jesse McCarthy puts it, part of the work here is thinking about the value of human life differently. It's he who suggests turning to Jill Scott's Heron's song, "Who will pay reparations on my soul," in order to transcend the logic of material compensation. So what would it mean to rethink human life? What is the permanent renegotiation and readjustment that Scott recommends? Perhaps it begins with the realization that we should not blind ourselves with a vision of enlightenment, and embedded in it with the hope that reparations can be offered once and for all. To live the afterlives of long histories of violence that belie the teleology of universal history and the romance of an awakening reason that guarantees the possibility of restoration and redress. Abdulrazak Gurnah's novel Afterlives frames romance in tragedy, whose rhythm, as Scott explains, is more tentative, its direction less determinative, more recursive, and its meaning less transparent. Tragedy, he ends, has a more respectful attitude to the past, to the often cruel permanence of its impress, and it reopens a path to formulating a criticism of the present. Gurnah's polyphonic novel, in which Arabic and Hindi are used alongside Kiswahili, German, and English, decenters the Eurocentric account of history that dominates European commemorations of the world wars, in which colonial soldiers are either not mentioned or celebrated as heroes. Looking at life differently means, after Gurnah, a return to humanity, for nuanced stories that offer these souls, disfigured by the fraught circumstances of their conscription, a home in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Corina. I'm proud of you. I'm sure we are